Miami, 1938. A young Spanish prince lies in a hospital bed. His abdomen is swelling. His lips are turning blue. He is bleeding internally, and no one can stop it. Hours earlier, he was walking, laughing. Then came a sudden pain, a car ride, and a rupture inside his body. But this isn't just a medical emergency. This is a death sentence that began the day he was born. Because Prince Alfonso of Spain had hemophilia. His blood couldn't clot. His body couldn't heal. Now, at 31, the heir of a vanished throne is dying, quietly, in exile. No crown, no country, no children. Just a name, and a body that never stopped bleeding. He was born to inherit a crown, but inside him, a quieter inheritance waited. One that would take everything away. He was beautiful when he was born. Small, fragile, and pale, like a porcelain doll wrapped in silk. They named him Alfonso Pio Cristino, Eduardo Francisco Guillermo Carlos Enrique, Eugenio Fernando Antonio Venancio, a name long enough for a king. It was October 10th, 1907. Spain was still a monarchy. His father, King Alfonso XIII, ruled with vigor, and his mother, Queen Victoria Eugenie, had just fulfilled her royal duty. She had delivered a male heir. There were bells, cannons, flags. A nation rejoiced. But within days, a shadow began to form. Not political, not yet, but biological. The queen noticed the first signs. A bruise that spread across the infant's leg like spilled ink. A few drops of blood from the navel that didn't seem to dry. Nothing alarming, not at first. Babies bruise, babies bleed. But this wasn't just a baby. This was a Bourbon prince. And in his veins ran the blood of Queen Victoria. What many didn't know was that Queen Victoria had passed on more than political alliances to Europe. She had passed on a mutation, a tiny genetic glitch, hemophilia. The disease is almost poetic in its cruelty. The body makes no mistake, except one. It forgets how to stop bleeding. A single injury can become an endless leak. Blood spills into joints, swells beneath skin, pools behind organs. Every bruise is a gamble. Every scrape, a threat. A life lived under the shadow of a paper-thin vessel wall. Hemophilia is passed down through mothers, carriers who are often unharmed. But it devastates sons. And Victoria Eugenie, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was a carrier. When baby Alfonso bled, he didn't stop. Doctors whispered in corridors. Nurses cried behind closed doors. The king, furious and confused, blamed the queen, an Englishwoman, a foreigner, whose blood had tainted the royal line. They tried to keep it quiet. No court bulletins, no announcements. But servants noticed the endless bandages, the way Alfonso was never left alone, the way he was never allowed to fall. He wasn't allowed to be a child. Not really. As the months passed, more bruises appeared. One day, he bumped his head while learning to sit. The swelling was grotesque. A purple balloon grew behind his ear. He screamed through the night, thin, high cries echoing down marble hallways. The doctors drained the blood, but more came. They wrapped him in cotton, kept him from other children, banned sharp objects, locked away his toys. He became a prince in a padded cage, a little boy with golden curls and purple knees, a face too often twisted in pain. And still, he smiled. He tried to walk. He clapped when his mother entered the room. He played with wooden horses softly on velvet cushions. He didn't know that his body was wrong, not yet. But the royal court did, and so did Europe. Behind closed doors, other monarchs whispered. Another hemophiliac prince, just like the Russian Tsarevich, Alexei, just like the sons of Prussian dukes. The bloodline was breaking everywhere. Hemophilia was the curse of kings, and Spain had just inherited it. Still, the public saw only portraits. Chubby cheeks, lacy collars, paintings and photographs that showed a healthy boy next in line for the throne. But behind the smiles was fear. Behind the portraits were tears. The queen was blamed for polluting the Spanish royal house. Whispers of annulment, of exile, followed her everywhere. Yet she refused to abandon him. She stayed beside her son. She kissed his forehead after every injection. She held his hand when blood seeped from his gums. And in that silence, between needle pricks and compresses soaked in red, grew the terrible realization. This child would never live a normal life. And no amount of gold, no number of titles, no palace in the world could change that. Because he had inherited more than a throne. He had inherited a war inside his own blood, a war he would never win. He didn't run, he didn't fall, he didn't bleed, because the world wasn't allowed to touch him. He grew, but the walls grew faster. Alfonso turned 4, then 5, then 6. While other boys scraped their knees and chased dogs down palace corridors, he watched from behind windows. He lived in a palace of velvet and shadows, where sunlight was filtered through lace curtains and joy was measured in inches. A laugh too loud might lead to a nosebleed. A leap too bold could tear a joint open. His governesses were nurses. His playmates were doctors. And his toys, rubber balls, cloth dolls, wooden animals without sharp edges, were chosen not for delight, but for damage control. Every morning began with an inspection, not of uniforms or posture, but of skin. Purple spots, tender joints, a cut that hadn't closed from yesterday. Even the sound of Alfonso's pain became routine. The servants learned to recognize it, that sharp intake of breath before he cried, that soft whimper when his elbow locked with blood inside the joint. He was taught to stay still, to walk gently, to never fight, never fall, never forget that he was breakable. There were no games of tag, no horse rides, no climbing trees. His life was a daily negotiation between curiosity and catastrophe. His siblings, Jaime, Beatrice, Christina, loved him, but they were discouraged from playing with him. One push, one accidental nudge, that was all it would take. So they grew up around him, but never with him. They lived in the garden. He lived in the drawing room, surrounded by pillows and embroidery hoops and books about things he could never touch. From a distance, it looked serene. A quiet, intellectual boy with a thoughtful face and gentle hands. But the silence wasn't peace. It was paralysis. Because Alfonso was raised not to live, but to avoid dying. He learned early that his body was his enemy, a traitor with no loyalty. He didn't need to be stabbed or shot. His blood could kill him all by itself. Once, at the age of 8, he sneezed during dinner and began bleeding from the nose. The bleeding lasted 5 hours. Doctors stuffed gauze deep into his nasal cavity. He vomited blood. And when it stopped, He slept for 2 days, pale and silent, as if death had almost convinced him to stay. After that, the royal family agreed. No more public appearances, no balls, no ceremonies. The heir would be kept safe. But what is safety when it feels like suffocation? By age 10, Alfonso had become a master of hiding pain. He smiled through headaches. He swallowed tears when his joints swelled. He apologized when he bled. He began to understand that his existence came with a price, not just to himself, but to everyone around him. His father, King Alfonso XIII, visited less, ashamed perhaps, frustrated. The king wanted heirs who could ride horses into battle, who could defend borders, who could breed strong dynasties. But Alfonso was none of those things. He was a boy in silk who flinched at a paper cut. The queen remained his closest shield. She read to him, sat by his bed. But even her eyes grew tired. How do you mother a child you cannot save? The older Alfonso got, the more he realized what had been stolen from him. His right to play, his right to fight, his right to fall in love without fear of breaking. Every time he watched his cousins duel or ride, he felt the glass around him tighten. He was royalty, yes. But he wasn't free, and he wasn't just behind the glass. He was becoming the glass, transparent, fragile, handled with care, admired from afar, never held too tightly. He began writing letters, journals, private reflections filled with longing. He wanted to see the world, not through books or binoculars, but with bare hands and bruised knees. But his body wouldn't allow it. One summer, while vacationing in San Sebastian, he slipped on wet tiles near a fountain. His hips slammed against the stone. He didn't cry, he didn't shout. He simply whispered, "It's happening again." Blood filled the joint like oil flooding an engine. They carried him back inside, wrapped in silence. He couldn't walk for weeks, and he never forgot the sound of his own body trying to kill him. Quietly, patiently, without mercy. That was the lesson of his childhood. You can't escape your blood. It follows you. It turns joy into danger, and turns a prince into a prisoner. He didn't fall from grace. Grace fell from under him. The year was 1931. Spain trembled. Whispers of republicanism, corruption, and anti-monarchy protests had grown from murmurs into roars. Streets once lined with royal flags now echoed with slogans of revolution. And inside the royal palace, a family prepared to lose everything. King Alfonso XIII, Alfonso's father, had ruled for decades, often arrogantly, always stubbornly. But his support for the dictator Primo de Rivera had alienated too many. His name became synonymous with decadence and deafness to suffering. Now, the people wanted a new Spain, a Spain without kings, without princes, without velvet thrones and glass-bodied heirs. And so, the monarchy fell, quietly, bloodlessly. But for the royal family, it felt like internal hemorrhage. Slow, invisible, deadly. On April 14, 1931, the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. Alfonso XIII went into exile. No trial, no assassination, just a silent vanishing act. He boarded a train with a few loyal attendants, no fanfare, no goodbye from the people he once ruled. His crown didn't fall, it simply evaporated. And with him went his son, Prince Alfonso, still bleeding, still limping, still breathing in fear of his own body, now burdened by a lost identity. He was no longer Alfonso, Prince of Asturias. He was just Alfonso, a former heir, a fragile remnant of a crumbled house. They crossed into France first, then into Switzerland, and eventually, Alfonso found himself in Cuba, the homeland of his mother's nursemaid, where his lungs filled with warm ocean air. And for the first time, the weight of history felt thinner. But that feeling didn't last, because no matter where he went, he carried with him the twin ghosts of inheritance, Hemophilia, and a crown he would never wear. In exile, he was treated as both royal and irrelevant. European courts pitied him, some mocked him. To many, he was a walking reminder that monarchy wasn't just outdated, it was biologically doomed. And inside, Alfonso began to understand something tragic. His country hadn't just exiled him, it had outgrown him. Spain was moving on, fast, angrily, and he was stuck in a body from the 19th century, decorative, ceremonial, and utterly incapable of fighting for anything. There were moments he tried to pretend otherwise. He took up aviation. He studied navigation. He wanted to serve, not just as a figurehead, but as a man. But the bleeding always came back. Flying was dangerous. Turbulence meant bruises. Even the vibration of the plane could trigger internal ruptures in his joints. In a world moving toward war and steel, Alfonso was made of glass and red silk. He began to drift. From his father, from the exiled court, from the idea of Spain itself. He no longer belonged in palaces, but he didn't belong in hospitals either. He was a man between worlds, a man who had been born for destiny, but was now living accidentally. And then he met someone, not a princess, not a noblewoman, but a young Cuban woman named Edelmira San Pedro. She didn't care about his titles, or his bleeding, or the invisible wounds Spain had left on his pride. She smiled. She laughed. She loved him. And for once, Alfonso dared to believe he could choose something for himself. Not a throne, not a country, but a life. The royal family objected. Of course they did. Marrying a commoner was scandalous enough. But marrying a Cuban woman from a merchant family without aristocratic ties? Unthinkable. But Alfonso had already lost his crown. He had nothing left to protect but his own heart. And so, he made a choice. He renounced his rights to the Spanish throne. Official, public, final. The crown that had once weighed over his cradle was now cast away like an old suit of armor that no longer fit. He married Edelmira in 1933 in Lausanne. There were no royal trumpets, no military procession, just two hands clasped, and the soft sound of rebellion whispered through a kiss. The prince who had once been locked behind glass had shattered it, not with power, but with love. But glass cuts both ways, and what started as liberation would soon become another form of exile. He gave up a kingdom for love, but love does not promise to stay. The world outside called it scandal, but to Alfonso, it was freedom. When he married Edelmira San Pedro y Robato in 1933, the newspapers called it a royal humiliation. A prince, the son of a king, marrying a commoner from Cuba in a quiet civil ceremony far from the gaze of Spanish nobility? Unacceptable. The Spanish court, what little remained of it in exile, froze him out. No invitations, no acknowledgement, no titles. He was no longer Prince of Asturias. He had surrendered his birthright for a woman with no crown, no pedigree, and no use to the House of Bourbon. But he didn't care, because for the first time in his life, he had chosen something. Not a doctor, not a caretaker, not a protocol. He chose Edelmira. She was radiant in a simple ivory dress. She smiled as if his bleeding didn't frighten her. She kissed him like he wasn't made of glass. And when they walked out of the town hall as husband and wife, Alfonso said quietly, "This is the first day I have ever been just a man." They moved to the United States, settling in New York for a time, then Florida. There were no royal obligations, no guards, no photographers, just warm beaches, Cuban cafes, and the illusion of normalcy. Edelmira cooked. Alfonso read. They walked along the ocean, hand in hand, trying to forget the world they'd both left behind. And for a brief moment, it worked. But illusions, like bodies with broken bloodlines, don't last forever. Because hemophilia doesn't stop for happiness. At night, Alfonso still bled. His joints still locked with pain, his gums still oozed when he brushed his teeth. Edelmira would wake to blood-stained sheets. She would help him to the bathroom, hold his hand while he winced, and wipe his brow during feverish nights. But love is not always stronger than suffering. And watching the man she loved suffer endlessly began to change her. She tried to smile through it. She tried to stay soft. But inside, something hardened. Because no one prepares you for the helplessness of loving someone who is dying. Slowly, daily, invisibly. Arguments started. Not loud ones, but the kind that come from exhaustion. Alfonso, once so grateful for love, began to fear it. He saw in Edelmira's eyes the same look he had seen in his mother's. Compassion laced with regret. He knew he was a burden. He knew she had married more than just a man. She had married a diagnosis, a condition, a body that could collapse at any moment. He tried to shield her. He stopped talking about his pain. He laughed too loudly. He pretended every day was better than the last. But truth has a smell, a taste, and the blood on their pillowcases told a different story. By 1937, only 4 years after their wedding, the cracks became chasms. The silence at breakfast, the coldness in shared glances, the arguments about money, about privacy, about what it meant to live halfway between royal exile and American anonymity. One night, during a dinner that had begun with laughter and ended with tears, Edelmira whispered, "I married a man, but I spend every day mourning a prince who's still alive." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he was mourning too. They divorced quietly. No press, no scandal. Just papers signed, rings returned, promises buried. She left, and Alfonso remained. Again, alone. Not as a prince, not as a husband. Just a man with a broken body and no one left to choose him. In his apartment in Miami, he kept a small photo of their wedding day. He never spoke ill of her. He never remarried. Some say he still loved her. Others say he simply didn't have the energy to begin again. But what is certain is this. In choosing love over a throne, Alfonso thought he had escaped tragedy. He hadn't. He had simply changed its form. Even silence can bleed, especially when there's no one left to hear it. Miami, 1937. The heat was gentle. The palms swayed. And inside a modest apartment surrounded by whispering sea winds, a prince tried to forget he had ever been royal. After the divorce, Alfonso withdrew from the world. No more trips to Havana, no appearances in social clubs, no letters to distant relatives. He no longer had a country, no throne, no wife, and soon, almost no one at all. But he had something he had always craved in childhood: quiet. Not the controlled silence of palaces, but the stillness of anonymity. No one in Miami truly knew who he was. To most, he was just Mr. Alfonso de Bourbon, a well-mannered Spaniard with tired eyes, who walked carefully and rarely smiled too wide. The press had moved on. The Spanish monarchy was in ruins. The world was distracted by storm clouds over Europe. And so, Alfonso began living a life without history. He read the newspaper. He drank black coffee with sugar. He watched the waves crash like lungs exhaling. But even peace has a price. Because in that silence, there were no distractions, no courtiers, no family dinners, no duties, just his body and the bleeding that never stopped. Without Edelmira, there was no one to help with the bandages. He learned to press gauze with one hand while holding his breath. He learned to sleep propped upright so the bleeding wouldn't flood his throat. He learned to smile at his neighbors as he walked home, all while feeling the warm slide of blood behind his kneecap. Sometimes it pooled in his elbows, sometimes in his stomach, other times in his joints, causing him to limp down Biscayne Boulevard as if age had come early. But the worst were the nights. Nights when he'd wake up feeling as though something was breaking apart inside him, silently, without force. Just decay. Pain wasn't a sharp dagger anymore. It was a dull, constant ache, like being quietly erased. He refused to go to hospitals unless it was absolutely necessary. He'd seen the panic in doctors' eyes. They didn't know how to stop the bleeding. They didn't know how to fix something that had been broken from birth. Hemophilia was still poorly understood. There were no clotting factor injections, no gene therapy, just ice packs, compression, prayer. And Alfonso had stopped praying long ago. His mother, Queen Victoria Eugenie, still wrote to him, short letters, full of longing and guilt. Sometimes they'd speak by telephone. She would ask, "Are you feeling well today, my son?" He would always answer, "Better than yesterday." It was a lie. But what else could he say? "My joints are rotting. My gums are bleeding. I'm afraid to sleep because I don't know where I'll be bleeding next." No. Some truths were best kept in the dark. He tried to distract himself with books. He read medical journals, searching for hope. But every article about hemophilia was either cold or clinical. And every promising study ended with the same words: no cure. He began visiting churches, not to worship, but to sit. The cool stone floors soothed his legs. The silence reminded him of his childhood in royal chapels. But now, no choirs sang for him. No bishops bowed. He was just another tired man with tired eyes, sitting in the back pew, hoping no one would recognize his name. Because that name, Alfonso de Bourbon y de Battenberg, was no longer a title. It was a relic, a reminder of what had been lost. And deep inside, he began to feel it. The countdown. The sense that time was closing in, that his body, already so fragile, was preparing for its final leak. But he kept moving, kept walking, kept smiling at neighbors who waved, never guessing that the man who tipped his hat to them had once been a heartbeat from a throne. And perhaps that was the final tragedy. Not that he was dying, but that the world no longer remembered who was dying. A prince born to rule now lived like a ghost, and no one knew he was bleeding from within. It wasn't the crash that killed him. It was the blood that refused to stop flowing. September 4th, 1938. It was a Sunday. The sky over Miami shimmered in late summer heat. Waves licked the shore, families picnicked in the parks, and Prince Alfonso of Spain, though no one called him that anymore, stepped into a car with a quiet smile. The details are fuzzy. There was no grand motorcade, no bodyguards, just a borrowed automobile, a friend at the wheel, and Alfonso sitting calmly in the passenger seat. He was 31. He looked older, thinner, paler, but still alive, still smiling, still walking through a life that had tried to crush him without ever truly touching him. They drove through Coral Gables. Palm trees blurred past. The wind cooled his face. And then, something happened. A sudden stop, a swerve, an impact. Mild, forgettable. A fender bender, barely enough to damage metal. But it wasn't the car that mattered. It was what shifted inside him. The jolt slammed Alfonso's torso forward. He was wearing no seatbelt. Few people did in 1938. He winced, placed a hand on his abdomen, said nothing. They checked the car. All seemed well. No one panicked. Alfonso said he felt fine, just a little shaken, maybe a bruise forming. He went home. That night, the pain began, a dull ache behind his ribs. Then a sharp twinge when he bent over. Then nausea, dizziness, a sudden drop in body temperature. He tried to sleep it off. He couldn't. By morning, he couldn't stand. He was rushed to Jackson Memorial Hospital. A surgeon was called in. They suspected a ruptured organ, possibly the spleen or liver. Internal bleeding, fast, invisible, silent. They prepped him for emergency surgery. Alfonso knew what was happening. This wasn't the first time his blood had turned against him. But this time, it felt different. Deeper, colder, like his body had finally grown tired of holding the line. On the table, he told the nurse, "Please, don't let me die bleeding." They opened his abdomen and found what they feared most: a massive internal hemorrhage, blood pooling like dark ink in every cavity. The result of a minor trauma made catastrophic by hemophilia. They tried to suction the blood. They tried to suture the tear. They tried ice, pressure, transfusions, but nothing worked. Because Alfonso's body lacked factor VIII, a protein crucial for clotting. His blood was just water with color. It seeped through gauze. It gushed from every incision. It refused every attempt at control. He lost consciousness. Then came shock. Blood pressure plummeted. Organs starved for oxygen. And sometime in the early hours of September 6th, Prince Alfonso of Spain died on the operating table. There was no royal physician, no priest, no royal banner over his chest, just a surgical light above his head, a half-written chart, and a puddle of his own blood still warm on the floor. The staff was stunned. Many hadn't even known who he was. The man who had just died wasn't a patient with privilege. He was a body undone by biology. A former Prince Mountaina, forgotten by time, who bled to death in a modern hospital while the world kept spinning. His death didn't make headlines. Not in Spain, not in London, not even in Cuba. It was a tragedy too quiet, too technical, too far from the romantic drama of royal assassinations, ambitions, or grandiose suicides. But for those who understood, his death marked the end of a line. Alfonso was the eldest son of a king. He should have been next. He should have reigned. He should have been crowned in Madrid, his name inscribed on Spanish coins. Instead, he was buried in Florida. No anthem, no procession, no monument. His blood had denied him everything. And in the end, it took even his breath. What made it worse was this. It could have been a survivable injury. In a healthy man, the rupture could have been clamped, stitched, healed. But Alfonso wasn't healthy. He never had been. He was born into a war between clot and cut, and he had lost every single battle in silence. His brother Jaime, who had suffered deafness from a childhood operation, would later reflect bitterly, "We were cursed from the beginning, born with broken pieces." And he wasn't wrong. The Bourbon bloodline, once proud and pure, had become a ticking time bomb in every male heir. Hemophilia didn't just kill Alfonso, it killed the Spanish monarchy's future. Because with his death, the line of direct succession faded. Future claimants would argue, splinter, fracture. The dynasty would spend decades trying to find its voice again. And Spain, already deep in political chaos, would move forward without ever truly mourning the prince who might have saved it. Had he only been able to stop bleeding. A country once waited for his coronation. But when he died, it didn't even lower a flag. His body lay cold on a hospital gurney, uncrowned, unclaimed. The doctors had done all they could. They signed the death certificate. Cause of death, internal hemorrhage due to hemophilia. But no telegrams arrived from Madrid. No national mourning was declared. No royal envoy was sent to retrieve the body. Spain did not weep. Spain looked away. By the time of Alfonso's death in 1938, Spain had become a fractured and burning battlefield. The country was 2 years into its civil war, a brutal conflict between Republicans and nationalists, between democracy and dictatorship, between past and future. The monarchy, once the central axis of Spanish life, was now a memory too painful to revisit. King Alfonso XIII, Alfonso's father, was still alive, living in exile. But even he remained distant in the days following his son's death. There were no public statements, no declarations of grief, no royal family reunions. The House of Bourbon, once proud and united, had collapsed into silence and splinters. Alfonso's siblings, Jaime, Beatriz, Gonzalo, were scattered across Europe, each burdened by their own struggles. None could travel quickly. None had the power to demand tribute. In Miami, no one quite knew what to do. The man who had died was royalty, yes, but also just a foreigner in exile. No embassy took charge. No cathedral offered to host the funeral. Instead, a small local chapel was contacted. A private funeral was arranged. No reporters were invited. No nobles came. Only a few distant friends, a nurse who had helped him once, and a priest who had never met him, stood in attendance. The casket was plain. The room smelled of lilies and dust. And as the priest read a quiet prayer over the closed coffin, the legacy of a crownless prince was sealed not with a flourish, but with a sigh. There were no uniforms, no 21-gun salute, No golden cross draped in royal velvet. Just a body, a name, a stillness. A few miles away, on the sunlit streets of Miami, the world moved on. Children played in fountains. Radio stations played dance music. Newspapers focused on the Spanish Civil War, Hitler's rise, and Roosevelt's policies. There was no headline, "Prince of Spain dies at 31." There was only a footnote in a foreign obituary column, printed in small type. Alfonso de Bourbon, former Prince of Asturias, passed away after complications from internal bleeding. Survived by a family in exile. That was it. No mention of the boy who once played alone in a velvet cage. No mention of the teenager who gave up his title for love. No mention of the man who bled every week of his life but still rose each morning with dignity. The world didn't ignore him maliciously. It simply forgot. Because Alfonso had never ruled. He had never fought a war, never signed a law, never led a nation. He was a symbol without a story. And symbols, when cracked, are often thrown away. But to those who knew, the silence cut deeper than any funeral dirge. Queen Victoria Eugenie, his mother, collapsed in tears when the news reached her. They said she stayed in her room for 2 days, refusing food, refusing visitors. She had always feared this ending. And now it had come, just as she had dreamed it. Invisible, distant, and soaked in blood. She had passed hemophilia to her son, and now she would live the rest of her life knowing that her blood had been his undoing. Alfonso the 13th, his father, responded with only one sentence. "He is at peace. Let us not speak of it again." A king's heart, hardened by exile, had no more space for mourning. Too many losses, too many regrets, too much silence. Back in Spain, few even remembered Alfonso. The war had devoured memory. Statues were torn down, flags burned, names erased from schoolbooks. And in the middle of it all, the once crowned child had become a ghost. Even decades later, when Spain restored its monarchy under Juan Carlos III, Alfonso's nephew, no national monument was ever raised in Alfonso's name. No plaza, no scholarship, no public commemoration, just a grave. A plain stone in Woodlawn Park Cemetery, Miami. It reads, Alfonso de Bourbon y Battenberg, 1907 to 1938. No mention of titles, no mention of Spain. Just a name and 2 dates, a life punctuated by bleeding and silence. He had died as he had lived, too noble to be forgotten entirely, too inconvenient to be remembered fully. He never ruled, never led an army, never signed a treaty. And yet, his bloodline shaped the fate of a kingdom. There are men who leave their mark in stone, through wars, decrees, revolutions. And then, there are men like Alfonso de Bourbon y Battenberg, whose legacy lies not in what they did, but in what their bodies could not do. Historians rarely agree on how to remember him. To some, he is a footnote, a fragile prince in exile, tucked between more dramatic chapters of Spanish collapse. He was born, he bled, he died, end of story. But others argue that this dismissal is a second injustice, one that repeats the silence that haunted his final days. Because Alfonso's life, though brief and quiet, sits at the intersection of monarchy, medicine, and tragedy. His existence reveals how royal families, for all their power, could still be torn apart by something as microscopic as a broken gene. Hemophilia has long been called the disease of kings, and for good reason. Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, great-grandmother to Alfonso, was a silent carrier. She passed the defective gene to her daughters, who then spread it across Europe like an invisible curse. The Russian imperial family, the German duchies, the Spanish Bourbons. One by one, the blue blood turned thin. Modern geneticists now know the mechanics. Hemophilia A, the type Alfonso had, is caused by a deficiency in clotting factor VIII. The gene responsible for producing it sits on the X chromosome. Women, having two X chromosomes, can carry the gene and show no symptoms. But men, with only one X, are left defenseless when that single copy is flawed. It's ironic, almost poetic, that the very concept of monarchy, so obsessed with bloodlines and inheritance, was undone by the actual blood within its heirs. Alfonso embodied this paradox. He had the name, the ancestry, the training, but not the body. Not the physical capacity to lead men into war, to endure assassination attempts, to survive even minor injury. He was royalty trapped in a vessel that betrayed him at every step. Some royal biographers dismiss him as a lost cause from the start, genetically doomed, as one put it, a ceremonial ghost born into a dying world. They argue that he never truly mattered, that Spain had already begun drifting away from monarchy, that civil war and modernity would have drowned him even if his blood had clotted properly. But this view misses something deeper. Alfonso's life isn't just about what was lost biologically. It's about how monarchy responded to that loss. He was protected, yes, but also hidden, denied, used as a symbol when convenient and exiled when inconvenient. Even his family's affections were laced with disappointment. Behind palace doors, courtiers gossiped about his weakness, his limitations, as though illness were a character flaw. What they feared most wasn't his fragility. It was what it represented. The truth that kings, like all men, can bleed uncontrollably and die young. That no crown can protect a body from entropy. That no name, however noble, can stop the silent corruption of cells. Alfonso's decision to renounce his succession for love was framed by many at the time as weakness, even betrayal. But in retrospect, it was one of the most human and courageous acts of his life. In a family obsessed with lineage and image, he dared to choose happiness over legacy. He dared to love, and he paid for it with invisibility. After his death, his story was largely erased. His grave bore no royal title. His memory was not preserved in state archives. For decades, even Spanish textbooks omitted him, focusing instead on more relevant figures, generals, presidents, monarchs who actually ruled. But slowly, something changed. In the late 20th century, with the rise of interest in genetic diseases and medical history, Alfonso's life began to resurface, not as a political study, but as a biological case file. Medical historians began connecting the dots between him and other hemophiliac royals. Suddenly, he was not just a forgotten Spanish prince, but part of a larger dynastic pattern. A living consequence of consanguinity, unchecked tradition, and the tragic ignorance of early genetics. His name appeared in journals, textbooks, even university lectures on the dangers of inherited illness in ruling families. He became not a footnote, but a warning. And yet, even that recognition came with detachment. They studied his blood, not his heartbreak. They analyzed his DNA, not his loneliness. The clinical view remembered the mechanism of his death, but forgot the man who endured it. So how should we remember Alfonso? Not as a ruler, not as a martyr, but as a mirror. A reflection of a system that prized bloodlines, yet could not protect those born with the wrong version of that blood. His story is not just about hemophilia, it's about shame, silence, the way power disowns those who no longer fit the narrative. It's about a child who was told he was born to lead, but was never allowed to run. A man who was called fragile, but still walked tall. A name that carried centuries of history and yet disappeared with barely a whisper. Alfonso died young, in pain, in exile, in obscurity. But he also lived, gently, lovingly, bravely. And that is worth remembering. No statue, no anthem, just a stone in the silence of a name, without a crown. There is a grave in Miami, small, flat, almost invisible. It lies beneath the palms of Woodlawn Park Cemetery, tucked between rows of strangers, men and women who lived ordinary American lives, most with no ties to royal blood or fallen thrones. The stone reads, Alfonso de Borbón y Battenberg, 1907, 1938. That's all. No Prince of Asturias, no mention of Spain, no reference to the crown he was born to inherit, or the title he renounced for love. Just a name and 2 years etched in marble. Start, end, nothing in between. No one would guess, walking past that grave, that beneath it lies a man whose blood once connected two of Europe's most powerful dynasties, the British House of Windsor and the Spanish Bourbons. That the veins under that earth once carried the same mutation that shaped the fate of Russian czars, German dukes, and Portuguese queens. There are no flowers, no royal emblems. Only weeds in the dry grass and the occasional shadow of a bird passing overhead. And yet, that grave might be the most honest monument Spanish royalty ever produced. Because it tells the truth no anthem dares to sing, that power cannot prevent decay, and that even the heirs of empires are made of nothing more than soft tissue, fragile vessels, and blood that may never stop flowing. Unlike statues, this stone doesn't pretend. It doesn't show Alfonso atop a rearing horse. It doesn't cloak him in armor or wrap him in ceremonial robes. It doesn't freeze him in idealized youth. It simply admits his presence, that he was here, that he existed, and that now he is gone. No funeral bell ever rang in Spain for him. But perhaps this stone is a bell of its own kind, silent, unstruck, waiting. A bell no one hears unless they kneel beside it, look closer, and care enough to read the name beneath the dust. What remains of Alfonso isn't in museums. His childhood clothes, his letters, his medical records, most were lost or discarded. The monarchy had no desire to preserve what it deemed failure. And in exile, failure is a heavy suitcase no one wants to carry. Even in royal genealogies, he is often footnoted. Renounced succession. Died young. No issue. But a name is not just a historical entry. It's a vessel of memory. And when history deletes a name, it doesn't just erase the man. It erases the questions his life asked of the world. Questions like, what happens when royal blood betrays its own vessel? What does a crown mean if the head it rests upon can't survive its weight? And what legacy can you leave behind when your body refuses to cooperate with destiny? Alfonso left no children. His marriage dissolved. He had no statues erected in his image, no books written during his lifetime. Even his funeral lacked mourners. But that does not mean he left nothing behind. He left the symbol of absence. A royal heir whose story wasn't of conquest or reform, but of restraint, silence, fragility. In a world obsessed with visible legacy, parades, portraits, proclamations, Alfonso left a deeper mark, the quiet reminder that not all tragedies make noise. His life forces a reckoning with the mythology of monarchy, the idea that royal blood guarantees strength, that titles ensure worth. But Alfonso had both, and yet he bled from within until there was nothing left to give. And so his grave stands, or rather, lies low. It does not demand attention, but for those who find it, it speaks more than any statue ever could. It says, "This is where the bloodline broke. This is where silence won. This is where the heir to a throne was buried without a crown, without applause, without denial." He is not in Madrid. He is not at El Escorial, where kings and queens of Spain lie entombed in gold and granite. He is not remembered in stained glass. He is not honored in cathedral prayers. Instead, he rests where no one thought to look, in a cemetery in Florida, surrounded by strangers, beneath a name only history still recognizes. And maybe, just maybe, that is fitting. Because Alfonso lived between worlds, between palace and hospital, between monarchy and exile, between the dream of immortality and the reality of a body that could not hold it. He was never allowed to be whole. Not as a child, not as a man, not even in death. But in that simple stone, in that nameless silence, in that forgotten corner of Miami, he is finally undisturbed, finally unjudged, finally free. He was born into power, but died asking for something far more fragile, the right to be human. There are stories that fade, and there are stories that never had a voice to begin with. Prince Alfonso's life was one of the latter. It didn't end in war, scandal, or revolution. It ended in blood, in silence, in a hospital far from home. He didn't fight battles. He didn't sign decrees. He didn't conquer land or write philosophy. But he suffered, quietly, daily, and with a grace that no crown could bestow. When we think of monarchy, we think of grandeur, gold, robes, thrones, but beneath the fabric, all monarchs are flesh, and Alfonso's flesh never stopped betraying him. What makes his story so haunting is not how he died, but how early his fate was sealed. From the moment of his first bruise, his life was no longer his own. He became an heir not just to a throne, but to a flaw. A secret code passed down silently, locked in his chromosomes. A code that whispered, "You will be remembered for your weakness, not your will." But here's the truth. Alfonso wasn't weak. He was stronger than most of us will ever be. It takes strength to live with pain, to watch others run while you're told to sit still, to smile through broken joints, to fall in love knowing that love will cost you your legacy, to walk into exile without bitterness, to die slowly, knowingly, and with dignity. Many rulers wear armor to appear brave. Alfonso wore no armor, only linen bandages soaked in red. And perhaps that is more heroic than we've been taught to believe. He was born in a palace, but he died in a rented apartment. He was raised for a crown, but he gave it up for love. He was promised immortality, but even his grave was nearly forgotten. And still, he never lashed out, never demanded the world to bow, never cursed the name that broke him. Instead, he lived simply, and he endured. To me, that's the part that lingers. Not the medical charts, not the royal titles, but the quiet image of a man pressing gauze to his own skin in the dark, knowing the bleeding might never stop and choosing to rise anyway. There's something holy about that, and it forces us to ask, how do we define legacy? Is it in monuments, statues, books, or is it in what we refuse to let break us? Alfonso never ruled Spain, but he ruled something harder, his own despair. And maybe that's enough. Because what killed him wasn't just a ruptured vessel. It was a world that had no place for broken kings. And yet, in that emptiness, he created meaning. Not through power, but through presence. He existed. He bled. He mattered. So, if you ever find yourself in Miami, walk past the noise, past the palm trees, find that quiet cemetery, kneel by the grave that doesn't ask to be seen, read the name, say it out loud. Alfonso. Say it not as a king, not as a failure, but as a man who wanted simply to live without fear of his own body. He never stopped bleeding. But maybe now, he can finally rest. I didn't know Alfonso before writing this. I had heard the name. But like most people, I'd walked past his page in history. Now, I can't stop thinking about him. Not because he ruled, but because he didn't. Because he reminds me that history isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written in the bodies of those who never had a chance to fight. And sometimes in the silence they leave behind.